salt is the best substance to increase blood circulation. And so it dilates the arteries as well. So it's like the best vasodilator. Like, it's funny how athletes are looking for the next best thing.
Arginine and all that,
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, look within yourself, look what you're losing when you sweat out salt. So replace that prior to actually exercising, and you get the vasodilation properties, which helps release heat and actually increases sweat production. So you can, and that's how we cool off, right? Is sweating. So we get all these enhanced benefits. I call salt like the sixth factor in fitness because it helps regulate your body temperature, cools you off. It reduces your heart rate so you can work out longer, faster, harder. It increases blood circulation, so decreases cramping, muscle cramping, and actually it gets rid of acid in the cell. So there's this sodium hydrogen transporter, and basically in order to excrete hydrogen in the cell, you have to absorb sodium. So if your overtraining syndrome actually is a depletion of salt in your tissues, and so that's what ends up happening is people who continuously exercise, they're constantly sweating out salt, never replacing it back. And basically the tissues are just becoming depleted in salt, and you get all these symptoms of cramping, muscle spasms, things like that. And really salt is your gateway to exercise and eating healthy.
Hey friends, it's Mike Mutzel with High Intensity Health. Thanks for tuning back into another video. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. James Dinicolantonio. We're going to talk all about salt, minerals, and some of the research that he's been doing. Dr. James, you published over 200 papers.
That's right.
Which is really fantastic. I don't think we're at episode, close to 200, and we have not met with anyone that's published as much research. So congrats on that.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
So let's talk about salt.
Yeah.
What got you interested in learning and studying? And
Sure.
Yeah.
I've always been into fitness. I wrestled in high school and ran cross country, so I always knew that my fitness suffered if I didn't have salt. So to me, it never made much sense to follow the dietary guidelines and just restrict your salt intake, consciously go against what your body's telling you to consume. So really that kind of the kick started me to research salt, and I've always been interested in salt. And so that was one of the first substances that I really studied a lot and have been publishing on a lot.
Mm-hmm. So is salt kind of like fat, where in the sense like we've been talking how, traditional mainstream media in New York Times and these articles have vilified fat, and then we've kind of vilified salt, and there's some other researchers and I was mentioning offline to you, David Brownstein, he's been talking about all the minerals that are found in salt. So what is it that we got wrong on the perception of salt, that linking it with high blood pressure and that sort of thing? And then what are some of the missing elements that are so nutritionally good for us in salt that we're not getting if we restrict it?
Yeah, so I think we got, one thing we got wrong about salt is that we forgot that it's an essential nutrient, right? Yeah. It's actually the only essential nutrient we've ever demonized. Like, saturated fat is not an essential nutrient, cholesterol is not an essential nutrient, but salt is. And so we kind of took it definitely a step too far with salt. And so we forgot all the things that cause salt loss throughout the day. So I know you were drinking your coffee just now. Mm-hmm. Caffeine is actually one of the biggest factors that causes actually a ton of salt loss in the urine. So basically, even more chloride loss than sodium. So salt is made of sodium and chloride. And when you consume 4 cups of coffee, you actually lose an entire teaspoon of salt in your urine. Wow. And yet we're told to only consume 1 teaspoon or less. So you can just see from there that, from that aspect, that, wow, 90% of Americans are consuming 4 cups of coffee or more. And so you can see that, this is affecting a lot of people. And exercise, we lose a ton of salt as well. We can lose like half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of salt in just 1 hour of exercise. So for me, it just never made a lot of sense to cut salt. And then what's missing from salt, table salt, for example, doesn't have any of the minerals, iodine, magnesium, calcium, things like that. So we were talking like about Celtic sea salt. The gray salt is the highest in magnesium, so that is missing from table salt. There's other salts like Redmond Real Salt, which is my number one go-to salt. And the reason is because it's from an ancient dried up ocean. And so the modern day oceans actually are polluted, and they can have microplastics in them. And actually a study came out like about a week ago showing that it actually has like these microplastics in there.
So like endocrine disrupting chemicals, basically.
Pretty much, exactly. Like all the plastics that we're dumping into the ocean is actually getting into the salt that you're consuming. So I always try to find like an ancient dried up ocean, and actually Redmond Real Salt is from one of those ancient dried up oceans, which is kind of cool. Yeah. And it has like stable amounts of iodine as well. And we lose a ton of iodine in sweat, which is kind of, when I was doing research for the book, I didn't realize that you can lose up to 100 micrograms of iodine per hour of exercise. And
Whoa.
we're supposed to consume 150 micrograms
Yeah.
every single day. And so you can see that if you cut your salt out and you're losing that amount of iodine and you're not getting good sources of iodine, you kind of see how that can lead to issues, right? Hypothyroidism, it affects your metabolism, things like that.
You know what? It's so funny. So I used to do a lot of competitive bike racing, and I would notice that that people that would ramp up their training would generally like gain weight.
Yeah.
Which was really paradoxical. And obviously they would increase carbohydrates and stuff because they were in that old paradigm that carbs are really good fuel for endurance exercise and whatnot. But that connection between the iodine excretion and then hypothyroidism induced from like a nutritional deficiency through exercise, that's huge.
Oh my gosh.
No one's talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, we lose a bunch of minerals actually through sweat. One of the biggest ones is copper. We lose like 0.5 milligrams of copper per hour exercise, and basically no one's ingesting copper because
They're scared of it.
They're scared. Yeah, 100%. And then a lot of the low carb community, they're mainly focusing on animal foods, and really copper is mainly in plant foods. So
wow,
yeah.
That's really incredible. So going back, there's a lot of benefits, obviously, to some of these minerals and so forth that are found in like the Redmond Real Salt that you talk about. So we'll get, magnesium, sodium chloride, obviously iodine, other trace elements. So when we talk about like salt repletion, we're talking about like a whole broad spectrum of micronutrients.
100%. Yep, that's right. And so a lot of people though think that like Himalayan salt, it is the highest in potassium, but if you actually look at the amounts that you would get in a normal daily intake of, if all your salt came from Himalayan salt, like 10 grams of salt, you'd still only get about 40 milligrams of potassium. But really it comes down to the iodine, the magnesium, and actually the calcium that can actually have some type of added benefit. So for example, the Celtic sea salt does have about 40 milligrams of magnesium.
Nez, turn it down, please. Let's go. Do not do that again. We're recording. So if we just go back, scale back.
Yeah, sure.
Just repeat that.
Yeah, so for example, Celtic sea salt, it has 40 milligrams of magnesium per 10 grams of salt. And that's pretty good because most Americans are only getting 200 milligrams of magnesium. So that's literally 20% of your magnesium you can get if you consume Celtic sea salt. And so some people like to mix and match because Celtic sea salt's high in magnesium, whereas Himalayan salt or Redmond Real Salt is going to give you good amounts of iodine, which is not found in Celtic sea salt or the Hawaiian sea salts. So I have like a really cool table of the different nutrients that are in some of those common, more common salts, and you can kind of grab those and say, okay, I'm going to do Celtic because I don't get a lot of magnesium, or someone can be like, my diet is kind of lacking in iodine. I really need Redmond Real Salt to pull that iodine back.
That's fantastic. So what would be, so someone listening right now, they think, well, gosh, I haven't been supplementing with these really good salts. I've been kind of avoiding it because my doctor said it was linked with hypertension. What are some common symptoms? We talk about the thyroid, but what else would people experience?
Yeah, so first what happens when you cut your salt intake is your blood pressure goes down, right? Everyone thinks that's great. But actually what happens is it's kind of like restricting your water intake. Your blood volume goes down. And we know that that's happening because your heart rate gets elevated when you cut your salt intake. And in fact, that's actually one of the main eye-opening things that I discuss in my book is no one's ever looked at anything really but blood pressure. We've just hyper-focused on blood pressure. And actually, if you look at heart rate, the heart rate effects are actually stronger than the blood pressure reduction in almost everybody. So when you combine the blood pressure and heart rate, almost everybody is going to actually have a worse effect when you combine those two when they cut your salt intake. So the reason why your heart rate goes up when you cut your salt intake is when you go below 3,000 milligrams of sodium per day, your stress hormones, the noradrenaline and adrenaline, which are only supposed to kick in when you're biking or racing for a little bit, they're just chronically elevated. And same with the artery stiffening hormones, aldosterone, renin, angiotensin, that stiffen the arteries that we block with medications to literally reduce cardiovascular events. Yeah. Those get jacked up when you cut your salt intake. And what's interesting is we were talking a little bit about adrenal fatigue. Adrenal insufficiency is the medical term, but a lot of people use adrenal fatigue, but it is a real condition. And what happens is if you cut your salt intake and your adrenals are constantly pumping out aldosterone, that can lead to adrenal hypertrophy, and that's been shown in animal studies. And so you can literally burn out your adrenals if you just are on a chronic low salt diet. So that's a potential side effect too. So
those counter-regulatory hormones are going to be upregulated because there's not enough blood volume, and then they're trying to... That's incredible. Right? And heart rate's going to go up. So does it affect heart rate variability too?
It does. It does affect heart rate variability because the sympathetic nervous system really determines that, and low salt diets can burn out your sympathetic nervous system because they're just chronically elevated.
This is incredible.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. It's like such a basic concept, but people get it wrong, you know. So I'm really, really grateful for this conversation and your research.
Well, we were talking about how like salt is sort of like where we were 10 years ago with low carb and ketogenic diets. Like it's like at day one, like so many people don't really understand the benefits of salt, and that's why this book is so important.
Totally. That's fantastic. So, so we have cardiovascular related issues, you know, with low salt. What other symptoms? Maybe fatigue. And then what would it look like on blood work? Because we do see sodium, potassium, and calcium on blood, but does the body compensate to kind of...
It does.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. So what you're normally going to see is if you're exercising, you're fatigued, or your heart rate goes up, or you're dizzy. Those are very common symptoms. Or when you rise from a seated to a standing position, and you feel dizzy and lightheaded, which is extremely common.
So common.
That generally can indicate salt deficiency. But there's something called POTS. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Actually pretty common. About 3 million Americans have this syndrome, mainly in women. When they go from a seated to a standing position, their heart rate goes up by over 30 beats per minute. That's another symptom of salt deficiency, and we can treat POTS with actually giving people more salt. So those are some of the more common symptoms. Decreased capillary blood fill too. When you pinch your fingernails and the blood flow doesn't come back within 1 or 2 seconds, is a deficiency. Can be a deficiency in salt. Uric acid goes up, insulin levels go up when you cut your salt intake, because insulin helps the kidneys retain more salt, so you can literally store more fat per calorie you consume when you're cutting your salt. So you think you're doing something healthy, and you could be storing more fat because of that. Triglycerides go up, HDL goes down when you cut your salt intake, LDL goes up. So when you start adding all these harmful effects, it's kind of crazy that we would ever even think that, you know, just because it might lower blood pressure, which we just covered, might not even be a good thing, right?
Sure.
Blood volume reduction. It's crazy that they would, the guidelines would try to say, no, you should go against your salt cravings. We want you to consume no more than X amount, which never made any sense. But on lab work, what you'll see is everybody thinks that you're going to see low sodium levels in the blood. Now, it is very common. It's the most common electrolyte abnormality in both the inpatient and outpatient setting. Over 6 million Americans actually have hyponatremia, or low blood sodium levels, every year. And it's actually pretty prevalent in chronic kidney disease as well. Actually, more than 1 in 4 patients with chronic kidney disease over a 5-year period will actually have at least one episode of low sodium levels in the blood. But what you can see on lab work is you got to get like a 24-hour urinalysis sometimes, or fractional excretion of sodium. So what ends up happening is if you have a really high fractional excretion, you could be wasting salt because you have damage to the kidneys, or if you have a low fractional excretion, or a really low amount of sodium coming out in the 24-hour urine, despite you eating a good amount, that means your body's holding on to the salt, and that's a good indication of salt deficiency. It could also indicate that you're not absorbing salt well because you have damage to the intestine, like we were discussing. Crohn's disease and celiacs and IBS and ulcerative colitis. Those patients don't absorb salt very well. I actually counsel those patients on a daily basis.
In your clinical setting, that you also do along with the research.
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really important to note.
Yeah, and for just the average person, what you're going to potentially see is if you're drinking a normal fluid intake per day, BUN, which is blood urea nitrogen, can actually be elevated from a low salt intake, because BUN will rise from a reduction in blood volume, reducing blood flow to the kidneys, causing urea, which is supposed to be in the urine, to elevate. So if you have an elevated BUN, that is a potential indication of salt deficiency. And everybody, I mean, when you get your general labs, BUN is almost always on there.
Like 24. Yeah, it's high generally.
It is high generally.
And most doctors just say, we don't really know what to do with it. You're probably fine.
You're a little dehydrated, they say. And really, it's probably you're actually salt deficient.
Wow, this is really incredible. So, I guess I was trying to think, back like historically, if we look at the consumption of processed food, which a lot of people are consuming a lot of that, that is artificially, there's a lot of just sodium chloride being added to that. So is that part of the problem where people would have excessive amounts of just the salt without all the accessory micronutrients? So that's why the guidelines were maybe established in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think my mindset has always been don't blame salt for what the processed food and the sugar did.
Yeah.
Like honestly, so I really don't think it's necessarily the salt. And the reason is because if you think about the last 8,000 years, we've consumed an extremely high salt diet because we never had refrigerators. So our main food preservative was salt. And literally, when I was looking at some of the research, I was blown away about how much salt populations consumed like thousands of years ago. So the Romans, they consumed 25 grams of salt per day. And it was known, the Roman armies, they had to consume more than twice what we eat just to function well. So salt has always been known to have extremely important effects throughout history. But when I was looking at the intake in Europe, so in Sweden in the 1600s, they ate up to 100 grams of salt, which we would think is absolutely crazy, right? Because we only consume like 10 grams of salt. But your kidneys, they can completely handle, if you have normal kidneys, they can flush out 100 grams of salt, no problem. That's how efficient, because when I was actually researching how salt works physiologically with the kidneys, when blood is filtered in the kidneys, the salt is actually lost in the tubules. So and the kidneys have to reabsorb all that salt. That's actually 60% of the energy that the kidneys use every single day is reabsorbing the 3.5 pounds of salt that they filter. And so when I started realizing that, wow, we are basically essentially walking oceans, right? Like we are our blood is salty, and actually that's something I discuss in the book, is that our blood, the concentration of salt compared to other minerals in the blood is the exact same as the ocean. It's 90% of all the minerals in our blood is sodium and chloride, and that's the exact same percentages in the ocean, which was kind of cool. So we're constantly like filtering the salty blood in our body, and if we lose it, that's the problem. And our kidneys are constantly actively reabsorbing that salt. And so if you have damage to the kidneys and you can't do that, that's a big issue. But if you eat a ton of salt, it's actually a relief on the kidneys. They say, thank you, I don't have to reabsorb and spend energy reabsorbing all this salt. I can just let it freely pass. So eating abnormally high amounts of salt, like in processed foods, generally is not even a big issue at all.
Interesting. Okay. What about, like, we can talk about MSG and other bad things later and stuff like that, but it's really fascinating. So we're actually helping the kidneys out by having a higher salt diet.
100%.
The right kind of salt, like real food-based salt, like you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
Yeah, really interesting. And then so we're causing more issues if we're having high blood sugar levels, which damages the kidneys and so on. So that's part of the issue.
Yeah, what's cool is that salt and sugar look the same, right? These two white crystals, they have literally the opposite effects on the body. So sugar causes insulin resistance, low salt causes insulin resistance. It's crazy. So when I was doing a lot of my research, in ancient Roman times, they always actually put salt on their gums and teeth to prevent inflammation and dental caries. And sugar, we know, is one of the most common causes of dental caries. So I was like, when I was researching, it was almost like a yin and yang between the two, like salt good, sugar bad. And that was just something cool when I was doing the research for the book.
That's awesome. Just curious, how long did you do research for on this topic?
Yeah, it took me over 2 years to research and write this book. I mean, because no one's ever done a book about salt, right? So I literally had to write the book on it. And I read like well over 500 studies to write the book. It was just an absolute enormous amount of work, but I love doing it.
Thanks for doing it. Yeah, this is a much needed conversation to be had in this whole ketogenic, low carb, functional medicine space. So when you do research, I know it's kind of off topic, but are you printing out the full study and going through everything? Like, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I definitely don't just like read the abstract, right? And honestly, a lot of the studies are from really, really far back. So I'm that type of researcher that I want to know where it started. So basically the book goes from 1904, like where the actual salt blood pressure hypothesis began. So I kind of tell the story of these two French scientists named Ambard and Beaujard, and they just put 6 of their kind of sick patients on 20 grams of salt, which is more than twice than what we consume. And they saw that blood pressure kind of went up a little bit, and then when they cut the salt, it went down. And then 3 years later, another doctor said that didn't happen with his patient. So there was like the start of the salt wars right away in 1904, and then it carried over, and I go through some of the key players in the book, and we can talk about that if you want, but it's kind of interesting. I will say one thing about, for some reason in the 1950s, it was kind of common that patients and doctors would base a lot of the information on just like a single study, and what I found was this guy named Louis Dahl who was a doctor, he's pretty famous for genetically engineering these salt-sensitive rats because he knew that he could give normal rats like so much salt and it would never cause high blood pressure. He could give them the human equivalent of 100 grams of salt, would do nothing. Wow. So he genetically engineered salt-sensitive rats, and even in those rats, he had to give them the human equivalent of 40 grams of salt to even get an increase in blood pressure. Whoa. But most people don't know that. They just know about these salt-sensitive rats that came about. But Lewis Dahl is kind of the Ansel Keys of salt because he published a study, I think it was like 1954. And basically what he did was he picked just a few populations and showed pretty much like Ansel Keys did, right? He like just selected a few populations and said, as salt intake goes up, blood pressure goes up. But of course, when we look at inner salt, which had 48 populations, not counting the 4 unacculturated populations, blood pressure actually went down as salt intake increased. And we kind of discussed how that could happen, right? Because the artery stiffening hormones go down with more salt, and the noradrenaline and adrenaline gets lowered with more salt. So it actually, which is really crazy, is that low salt may actually lead to the very disease state that we think it prevents, hypertension.
Totally wild. I was thinking about that when I was driving over here, from Toronto, is that, you hit on it, like historically we would use salt to preserve our food. And so during the winter, we kill animals and preserve them and so forth. So how much, if we're talking about like ancestral humans and primal people, Papua New Guinea, stuff like that, the Maasai, how much salt are they having roughly?
That's a great question. So one of the arguments is that I get is advocates of the low salt diet will be like, well, we never consumed a lot of salt during evolutionary times. Mm-hmm. And actually it all stems from this one New England Journal of Medicine paper. Eaton was one of the authors. It's like the one of the kind of godfather, so to speak, of the paleo movement. Very, very smart guy. Yeah. But he kind of got it wrong about salt intake. So the New England Journal of Medicine paper actually, the sodium intake that they estimated during evolutionary times was no more than like 1,400 milligrams if you consumed a straight meat diet, and then like 400 milligrams if it was just vegetables. But he got it wrong because we would consume the whole organism, right? He didn't add in the salty blood, the salty interstitial fluid, the salty organs, the skin, bone marrow, all containing high salt. And so when you actually think about if we were to kill a deer, one deer has 30 days worth of a normal salt diet nowadays. So you can see how absolutely evolutionarily we could have gotten a ton of salt. And another substance that has a lot of salt is these tiger nuts, which were available during evolutionary times. And they actually have 3,300 milligrams of sodium per handful. And so it was shown, there's something called Nutcracker Man. He was like one of our ancestors, and he had all these basically dents in his molars from consuming these tiger nuts. And his diet was also high in crickets, which insects are actually pretty high in salt. And we kind of neglect the insects that we would consume through evolutionary time, but the salt actually seems to make insects fly faster, move faster, and I kind of use salt to do that for myself for my workouts. I dose myself with salt, and that's some of the benefits too that I've...
Like pre-workout?
Pre-workout.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
I'd love to get into that, but that's really fascinating stuff. I'm glad we kind of talked about it. But you're right. So humans now, modern day humans, are just having just red meat, just like ground beef and whatnot. So it's deficient in the salt. So if we're eating organ meats and eating like our ancestors did, making bone broths and so forth, then if we're not doing that, we're not getting the salt that we're talking about.
You got it. If you're eating vegetables and you're eating just dry hunks of muscle meat, you got to add the salt back. You got it.
Okay, fascinating. All right, let's talk about performance. So 1 teaspoon per hour of exercise, you said, is lost?
So basically on average, we're gonna lose about between a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of salt per hour of exercise. But if you are like a competitive soccer player, you can lose up to 6,000 milligrams of sodium per hour of exercise, which is like absolutely astronomical, right? We're only supposed to consume like 2,000 milligrams a day, and you can lose more than 3 times that in just an hour of exercise.
That's crazy.
So yeah, like what I do is I figure out what I'm gonna work out, like how long I'm gonna work out, and if it's gonna be like running plus lifting weights, or if I'm just gonna be lifting weights, and I will dose myself with salt depending on how hard and vigorous my exercise is gonna be. Normally what I do is half a teaspoon of Redmond Real Salt. I'll just take it straight up. It tastes, for me, it honestly doesn't taste bad. It's almost refreshing. Wash it down with some water. I'm good to go. 20 minutes later, hit the gym. And it's so interesting. Like last year, I hadn't, it was just the beginning of the summer and hadn't worked out for like 6 months. Joined the gym. The lady's like, you don't have to pay right now. Just go and do your workout. So hit the weights. and then decided I was going to run a mile. I literally like collapsed, basically fainted for 3 minutes, and I didn't dose myself with salt. Next day, dosed myself with salt, hit the weights twice as hard, ran twice as hard, fast, didn't feel any type of faintness, dizziness, anything like that. So, and people tell me that when they do that, it dramatically improves their performance. And the reason is salt is the best substance to increase blood circulation. And so it dilates the arteries as well. So it's like the best vasodilator. Like, it's funny how athletes are looking for the next best thing.
And all that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, look within yourself. Look what you're losing when you sweat out salt. So replace that prior to actually exercising, and you get the vasodilation properties, which helps release heat. And actually, what's funny is Ansel Keys actually did contribute something really good to the scientific literature. I found one of his studies, I think it was like in the 1940s. He actually showed that when exercising in the heat, if you were on a low salt diet, your body temperature was actually higher. And the reason is because salt helps vasodilate the arteries, helps release heat, and your sweat actually increases sweat production. So you can, and that's how we cool off, right? Is sweating. So we get all these enhanced benefits. I call salt like the sixth factor in fitness because it helps regulate your body temperature, cools you off. It reduces your heart rate, so you can work out longer, faster, harder. It increases blood circulation, so decreases cramping, muscle cramping, and actually it gets rid of acid in the cell. So there's this sodium hydrogen transporter, and basically in order to excrete hydrogen in the cell, you have to absorb sodium. So if your overtraining syndrome actually is a depletion of salt in your tissues, and so that's what ends up happening is people who continuously exercise, they're constantly sweating out salt, never replacing it back. And basically the tissues are just becoming depleted in salt, and you get all these symptoms of cramping, muscle spasms, things like that. And really salt is your gateway to exercise and eating healthy.
That's brilliant. And then you talked about earlier, like when you start to overtrain, you stand up real quick, you get dizzy, which I noticed right when I started doing like competitive bike racing and things like that. That was the first symptom. And actually once I started, per David Brownstein's recommendation, adding more Celtic sea salt, some of those symptoms generally went away. So let's talk about, some of the applications of like dosing salt. We talked about like pre-workout. Should people be having like 5 grams with each meal? Like, and some general recommendations for cuisine. Any tips there?
Yeah, so, well, what's interesting is we kind of talked about caffeine. So if someone's drinking a lot of coffee, they're going to need more salt. And so if someone's working out really hard, they're going to need more salt than someone else. But what I like to do is in the morning, like if I have some pastured eggs, I'll put some Redmond Real Salt on there, a little bit of pepper. And I don't just put like a little bit of salt. Like, I do a nice coating. And basically you salt to taste, right? So salt is our gateway to eating healthy. And really, it comes down to, if you overdo it, your body's going to compensate. And what's cool about salt is that you have a built-in safety mechanism. The taste receptors on your tongue will actually flip if you get too much, and provide you an aversion signal, which we know doesn't happen with sugar, right? Sugar, that sweet tooth doesn't go away. It actually gets stronger the more you consume of it. So what's cool is if you overdo it in one dish, you're not going to overdo it. Your body's going to send you a signal, and you might not salt your next dish. So really, it's almost like listening to your internal salt thermostat, which I kind of go over, like how the brain controls salt intake and things like that. And what's actually interesting too, we were talking earlier about how salt deficiency can potentially lead to sugar and drug addiction. And one reason how it does that is when an animal becomes depleted in salt, they know to somehow seek out like a salt lick. And so that we've always known that salt intake and drive to get salt is controlled by the body. But for some reason, we knew that about animals, but we forgot that it actually applies to humans as well. With the guidelines telling us, don't consciously restrict your salt intake, which I think is honestly like the worst thing you could ever do for your health. Because 2 of my family members actually were told by their doctors to cut the salt. Despite their bodies completely craving it, and they both wound up in the hospital with low sodium levels in the blood and like severe dehydration. Wow. So it just goes to show you, like, listen to your bodies. Your body is way smarter than any type of guideline or health agency's recommendation. But back to how salt deficiency can lead to sugar and drug addiction. How an animal or how a human knows to get more salt when it's depleted is the body actually activates the reward system in the brain. So that way you are driven via this type of internal craving to find salt in the diet. And when you do, you get a greater high from the salt. It tastes better. And some people have even told me when they're deficient in salt, it tastes like sweet, like salt almost tastes sweet. And the reason is because that activated reward system is going to save your life when you are deficient. So before we had salt all around us, if we were just an animal, that type of reward activation in the brain is literally going to save you from salt deficiency. Same thing happens in humans. Reward system gets activated, and now, unfortunately, sugar and things like drugs, substances of abuse can actually hijack that activated, sensitized dopamine reward system. And so that's how low salt diets can contribute to salt deficiency, potentially lead to sugar and drug addiction, which is crazy. Insane, right? So that's just one of the kind of mind-blowing side effects that I found about what happens when our bodies become deficient in salt. And there's all these effects that can happen too if you cut your salt intake. One study showed in people who exercise an hour a day, which I try to do. Basically, if you're following the low salt advice, consuming about 2,300 milligrams, so right at the top of what we're supposed to be eating. If you work out an hour a day, these people in this study actually became deficient in salt. And so what the body ended up doing is what they hypothesized was that the body was pulling sodium from the bone to maintain normal sodium levels in the blood. And at the same time, your osteoclasts, they're not like smart enough to just strip the bone and just only take sodium. They'll pull calcium and magnesium at the same time. And so they measured the calcium and magnesium in the urine on the low salt diet, and it was just spitting it out because it's probably being pulled from the bone. So it's crazy how osteoporosis, which we've always blamed on a high salt diet because salt can potentially increase calcium excretion in the urine, we've blamed osteoporosis on a high salt diet. And in fact, salt actually increases the absorption of calcium. No one ever kind of looked at that. And we've always, there's a few doctors who've kind of just solely focused on salt pushing more calcium out in the urine. But what's interesting is that you absorb more, so it kind of counterbalances itself. Yeah. And if you're pulling those minerals from your bones to maintain a normal sodium level, you can see that that can potentially lead to things like weaker bones, osteopenia, osteoporosis. And we've also blamed high salt intake on kidney stones because of the enhanced calcium in the urine. But what's crazy is the studies in humans show that giving more salt, actually supplementing people with 3,000 milligrams of sodium, reduces the risk of kidney stones. And the reason is because you drink more and your urine volume increases, and the actual concentration of calcium oxalate and things like that in the urine, the concentration of that goes down. So it's kind of crazy how we've blamed salt, and it's literally potentially a solution for the disease states that we've been blaming it for.
Oh, that's so wild. Gosh, it sounds just like fat in the sense, like you're making a lot of the different parallels for me. So, it's funny going back to the exercise, because the recommendations are like 45 minutes of activity to an hour, and people are exercising and doing weight-bearing exercises like running, walking, resistance training for their bones, yet if they're not supplementing with salt, they could be accelerating osteopenia, osteoporosis. Crazy. But let's just talk about other recommendations. Like, okay, so if you're going to go to the gym, you talked about like salting up beforehand, which is a really awesome tip. What about like people are drinking a lot of water throughout the day? Should we always either have mineral water like I have here? And we were talking about our favorite, Gerolsteiner. Really good stuff, guys. Well, let's talk about why Gerolsteiner is good, and then if people if they have their own filtered water at home, can they add the Redmond salt? And should they always salt their water?
It's a great question. Yeah. So living coastally, you're always going to get extra salt in your rainwater because it's going to come from the ocean. But as you said, tap water, it literally has no salt in it, and yet most athletes are just replacing either with water or even Gatorade, which we think is high in salt, but it's not even close to how much salt is coming out in your sweat. So you actually do need to, at least I need to dose myself with salt, and because you're not replacing what's being lost. And yeah, Gerolsteiner is great because it has one of the highest magnesium contents of all water. So I think it's got like 100 milligrams per liter of water of magnesium, which is great because most Americans are only getting like 200 milligrams. So literally 1.5 bottles of Gerolsteiner, and you're getting half of what most people consume in an entire day. And so most water doesn't have that. Gerolsteiner is really cool too because it has sodium bicarbonate. And so a lot of people aren't getting enough vegetables and getting bicarbonate. And so, people are talking about latent metabolic acidosis, which I personally believe is a true thing. Especially if you have kidney disease and you can't excrete acid very well. If you're lacking in vegetables and that bicarbonate, that Gerolsteiner is going to give you a lot of the bicarbonate you're not getting through fruits and vegetables.
Cool. Good to know. And then salting water. Like, so if you're just walking around, you're one of these people that has a lot of bodybuilders and fitness people have like a gallon jug of water they carry throughout the day to get their water in and whatnot. Should they add salt to it?
Yeah, so in my book I say no, don't, because it's gonna taste like sweat.
Yeah.
So you either take it dry, or what you can do is you can put it in like lemonade or lime juice or lemon juice, take it like a shot, but I honestly just take it dry and then wash it down with water.
Because it will taste kind of yucky, like you're drinking salt water. Like
Exactly,
in the ocean.
like you're literally drinking sweat.
Yeah, so don't, so just like bolus it.
Yeah, I mean, for coffee though, I do a little pinch of like mineral salt, and it takes away the bitterness.
Cool.
But even up to like 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt in like 3 cups of coffee, I'll do, and that works good for me. And some other people have said that's like perfect for them, like 1/8 of a teaspoon in about 3 cups of coffee.
It's awesome. Really good tips. You have so much more in the book. I'm excited to dive deeper into that. I've just got my copy today, guys, so it's a really fantastic book. So, James, you study a lot of other areas. We're talking about like the ketogenic diet and how a lot of people think the ketogenic diet is bacon and butter and lard and all that, but we're kind of forgetting, if we follow that approach, we're forgetting about this ecosystem called our microbiome that turns out to be very metabolically active. So you do a lot of research. Talk to us about like where people might go wrong on a low carb style diet.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went wrong with the low carb diet, 100%. It worked for me for 2 years, because if you're going to eliminate refined carbs and sugar, of course you're going to see benefits. And then people stall, and then people start gaining weight back, and that happened to me. What ended up happening is my waist circumference actually started growing like 2-3 inches. I was like, what is going on? So I started restricting my carb intake even more, and it got even worse. So that's where I learned about fiber. Basically, more or less resistant starch. It's the starch that you eat that hits the colon, feeds the good gut bacteria, produces all these short-chain fatty acids that improve insulin resistance and release GLP-1, which I published a paper in Open Heart BMJ about how that works. So yeah, fiber is a really big deal, and a lot of people shun it. And some people, honestly, they can't tolerate fiber. If you can't tolerate high fiber foods, do what works for you. But honestly, it dramatically improved my health when I started eating things like beans and Ezekiel bread, which is like a sprouted grain. It's one of the few grains that I will eat. And like basically cooked and cooled potatoes to just like double, triple, quadruple the fiber. If you cook a potato and then you cool it, you just like quadruple the resistant starch. So
interesting.
That's something that I've done for a while now, and it works out really well for me.
So by actually going against like kind of your intuition, we're following your intuition, but going against a doctrine of a low carb diet, you actually improved your weight. Lost more weight.
100%. And don't get me wrong, I'm still overall low carb. I'm still probably only getting maybe 120 grams of carbs. So compared to like the standard American who's getting 400 grams of carbs, right? That's pretty low. And by no means am I even a moderate or high carb intake, but I'm getting way more than what I used to. I thought 20 to 40 was what I should be doing, right? And it didn't work for me after a couple of years. And when I increased my carb intake via beans, I wasn't probably getting a lot of magnesium, and I was probably eating way too much meat. I was probably eating like 2.5 pounds of meat a day, and that's just like way too much iron for a male. Female, not menopausal, they need 18 milligrams of iron, so they need a lot more iron than a man. And the human body actually doesn't really have a good way to excrete iron, so you can accumulate a lot of iron if you overdo it, especially if you're a man. Yeah,
really good tip. But so you mentioned something about your paper with GLP-1s. We talked about gut hormones and the incretins quite a bit. I haven't read that particular paper, but let's dive into that.
Yeah, so basically your intestinal cells will produce GLP-1 when you feed them that resistant starch, which is really cool. And we know GLP-1, there's medications that are GLP-1 analogs, and basically that improves insulin resistance, reduces blood pressure, helps you get rid of extra salt if you need to, which is kind of cool. If you're someone that has high insulin levels, you could be retaining more salt, and really it's again, you're blaming salt for what the sugar did, right? A lot of times people, if they're sensitive, you should not be sensitive to salt. If you consume salt and your legs swell up, that is not normal. What's happening is your blood vessels, they're leaky, and salt is going from the blood into the interstitial fluid. So don't blame salt for what your underlying disease state is causing, and generally that's due to a diet high in sugar and refined carbs, causing insulin resistance and high insulin levels and causing you to over-retain salt. Yeah. But back to GLP-1, helps lower blood pressure, helps cardiovascular health, insulin resistance, as we just discussed, kidney health. So yeah, when you start putting back some of this resistant starch and feeding your gut bacteria and you produce these short chain fatty acids, you can get incredible benefits.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I mean, if people, I often like do seminars for doctors on this topic and ask the crowd, like, how does gastric bypass or bariatric surgery cause weight loss? What's the mechanism? And a lot of people say, well, it's really about nutrient restriction and stuff like that. But if you look at the incretins and the changes in the microbiome, reduce endotoxin levels and things, so it's really cool that these gut hormones just hours after the surgery are dramatically increased. So powerful stuff. And then I like that tip on the fiber. Other things like phytonutrients, you like to weave those in?
Yeah, no, I definitely think phytonutrients are important to consume, and especially spinach is really good too to get the lutein. So lutein is actually really important for preventing LDL from oxidizing, and for eye health it's incredibly important. And not a lot of people eat spinach, and I hate spinach. So what I do is I'll cook some pork chops, salt them really nice, get it, and then I'll let just those salty juices flow into a bowl, and I get this nice salty broth, and I'll be able to eat so much spinach, so I'm getting all the good magnesium and potassium and that I never would have gotten. So use salt to kind of flavor your food and eat those bitter healthy foods high in magnesium and potassium that you never would have had you not added the salt. And my kids won't eat vegetables or nuts or seeds or anything like that unless I put salt on them. But people are so scared of salt. They'd rather have their kids eat junk food as long as it's like low salt. It's labeled low salt, so it must be healthy, right? It's crazy. Like, we're scared of the most natural antimicrobial and preservative. We would rather have our kids have like artificial preservatives rather than salt because we're so scared of it for some reason.
You hit on something that sparked a little thought in my head. So you mentioned antimicrobial. So what is salt doing to the microbiome?
Yeah, so, well, one thing salt does is that it brings chloride, and your stomach acid is hydrochloric acid. So your stomach acid will go down if you don't have enough salt in your body. And so you won't be able to basically digest your food and absorb nutrients, and you can have bacterial overgrowth because you are literally having a reduction in hydrochloric acid production from restricting your salt intake. It's crazy, right? Yeah. So when you start understanding the benefits of sodium and chloride in the body and how it's an essential nutrient, your body controls it, you can start to appreciate the benefits of it.
Wow. People need to go eat more. I want to go get some more salt. I mean, we're having a little mineral water here, but that's amazing. Okay, so we can have reduction in hydrochloric acid production, which can lead to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, like you talked about, motility issues, and we can get reductions in bile flow, because it's all based upon HCl kind of sets the stage for the downstream digestive, iterative processes.
Yep, 100%.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah, you know so much about all these different micronutrients and macronutrients. It's really
Thanks, I
impressive.
appreciate that. Yeah, it's one of my passions is micronutrients for sure. And
love it.
I think you were kind of touching on it. We focus on macronutrients so much, and it's like the holy grail is micronutrients. Like, because we can get macros wherever we want, but the micros are so important for so many things. And I think a lot of disease states are actually caused by these subclinical micronutrient deficiencies. Mainly magnesium is a really big one, and I think manganese and copper is also a really big micronutrients that we're lacking because we're not eating a lot of plant foods. So
interesting. So we went all over the place, which was awesome. Any major highlights from the book that we didn't get to talk about, or something that you really want people to share before we go into our 4 final questions?
Yeah, I would just say, salt is the gateway to eating healthy and exercising, and what's better than that, right? So don't fear salt. It is, it's a natural substance. Your body controls its intake. It's an essential mineral, and listen to your body when it comes to your cravings for salt.
Brilliant. Love it. So the book's available pretty much anywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all over the place.
You got it. Yep, it's nationwide, Barnes & Noble. You can go on my website, thesaltfix.com, and get it from Amazon, or there's a few other links that people can purchase the book at. You can follow me on Twitter too, Dr. James Dinic, D-I-N-I-C.
You're pretty active on Twitter.
I am pretty active on Twitter.
Always sharing stuff, which is awesome. Cool. All right, so we have 4 final questions, a little bit more personal, kind of short format. If there was just one herb, nutrient, or botanical, James, you just could not live without, I have a suspicion of what it may be, or a micronutrient, what would that be and why?
Got it. I would probably say for micronutrient, magnesium, and the reason is your energy, ATP, isn't activated without magnesium. So ATP is actually magnesium ATP. And so people that are fatigued, all the time. They don't have any energy. They're always looking for caffeine or something like that. And literally they might just be deficient in magnesium. And magnesium controls sodium, potassium, and calcium in the body because it controls the sodium, potassium pump. And so it is really, really important. And that's probably something that if I would have to say is one of the most important micronutrients, it would be magnesium.
Magnesium. And so we talked about in the mineral water, Gerolsteiner, so it's higher in magnesium.
Yep.
What are your favorite foods that are high in magnesium?
So beans and nuts. So nuts are really high in magnesium, and a lot of people just don't like the flavor of nuts because they're bitter. So add some salt, right?
Yeah.
And get your mag.
Soak them. Yeah. So what we do at home is soak them overnight to like get the anti-nutrients,
Sure.
phytates, lectins, and so forth off the nuts. Then put them in a dehydrator at like 99 degrees or around there, so we don't like oxidize the fats. But put a little salt and garlic and different things on there, and they taste like they taste like they're roasted, but they're totally raw, which is really cool.
That's awesome.
That's fantastic. So if there's just one exercise that you could only do one because it's really good for your hormones, good for longevity, for the rest of your life, what exercise or movement would that be, and why?
That's a great question. I never even thought about that. Honestly, I think, well, for muscular strength, I think push-ups are huge and really underappreciated, but I think Ted Damon would say that that's probably one of his go-tos because it just hits so many things. And if you do like a really, really correct push-up, like slowly and do it right, you're hitting a lot your shoulders and your back and your chest and your triceps, core. So that's definitely when it comes to like muscular strength, I try to do that. But high intensity exercise is really important too. To get the cardio, just like, suicide sprints for a little bit to hit the cardio really quick. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend over exercising. I think that's a big issue, especially if you're not getting the salt.
Yeah, brilliant. So you've read a lot of research on exercise and movement, I regard it. So the traditional model is like, just get your cardio in 300 minutes or something plus or minus per week. And there's a lot of good research showing that actually resistance training can be a stronger offset, diabetes and disease. So if you had to pick cardio or resistance training, where do you stand?
I mean, hands down resistance training, hands down. And like you said, it's because resistance training, you're building muscle, and muscle is metabolically active, and so your basal metabolic rate goes up, and you're growing new mitochondria. So people who are suffering from fatigue and things like that, like obese people, they literally have less mitochondria in their muscle. And so growing muscle is one of your best ways to produce mitochondria biogenesis. So I think lifting weights is extremely important.
Yeah, it has more carryover, right?
Yeah,
is what you're
exactly. And muscle fatigue happens as we age. So it's like if you're not working out and offsetting the opposite of hypertrophy, right? Muscle
the breakdown, catabolism kind of thing.
Exactly, 100%. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so James, you got 2 kids, you got the clinical practice, you're doing a lot of research, you got the great book, doing a lot of things. What does your morning routine look like? We know a lot of successful people kind of have a set of values, rituals, things they do first thing in the morning. What do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I normally do in the morning is I will have 3 pastured eggs with some Redmond Real Salt, and I will also have I'll toast a piece of Ezekiel bread with some sesame seeds around the sesame Ezekiel bread. So sesame seeds are like, honestly, you want like a micronutrient, like bolus dose, Seeds and nuts are like just so great. And so what I'll do is I'll have like a handful of almonds too sometimes in the morning with some dark chocolate. And sesame seeds are pretty bitter though. So I'll either do salt or I'll do some dark chocolate and combine them. And that way it doesn't taste really, too bad.
Yeah. So scrambled eggs?
Nope, I don't scramble them because I get a little worried. I'm that type A personality, kind of like what you were describing with the nuts. That seems a little type A to me too. Yeah. Because when we want to do something right, we want to do it 100%. And so when you scramble an egg, you can potentially oxidize the cholesterol in the egg, and you can oxidize the yolk. Actually contains a good amount of omega-6. So you can oxidize that if you scramble them. So what I do is I just cook them over easy, so I'm not oxidizing the cholesterol and the linoleic acid in there.
Mm-hmm. And the lutein that you mentioned earlier, so there's lutein in the eggs, so that can...
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a great source of lutein, pastured eggs.
And so over easy, so that's almost getting a little bit of the yolk raw.
Yeah, brilliant. Exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, really, really good tip. I love that, the seeds. And then you mentioned chocolate. I know chocolate, or I've read, has a decent amount of magnesium too.
It does, yeah. Like dark chocolate is another just micronutrient powerhouse that if you just add some seeds and nuts and dark chocolate to your diet, you'd be really surprised at how enhancing that is to your overall micronutrient density of your diet. It really can make a huge difference. And the almonds bring omega-3s, which so many people are just completely deficient in. And I think that we need to be eating a lot more seafood or supplementing with an omega-3 supplement. I absolutely think that's extremely important. I supplement with omega-3s because I don't probably eat enough seafood as much as I should because I just don't like the taste. I mean, who would honestly choose like wild salmon over like a juicy like prime rib, like like, you know what I mean? The flavor is just not there. Yeah. So sometimes I might only eat seafood once a month, and it's just a great way to just maintain a higher level of omega-3s, which is so important on so many levels.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I personally take around 2 to 3 grams a day.
That's great.
Depends on what I've been doing, how inflamed I am, et cetera, et cetera. So this final question here is kind of to see how we can affect the health of communities and larger groups of people. So if you were to bump shoulders with a politician, president, someone from the World Health Organization in an elevator, and they turned to you and said, James, you're doing a lot of research, you're working with clients, working with patients. What's one health or lifestyle tip or just soundbite that I should know about to maybe kind of influence some policy around? What would you say to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's deep too.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think from the ground up, we need to completely dissolve like how guidelines are written and how these committees are assembled, and it's like a closed door, right? It's like we are fighting, it's like underground nutrition. We're trying to get the word out, and we can't because these committees hold the key, and it's up to them. If they decide that saturated fat is bad, they don't want to look at some of the evidence, they're allowed to not look at some of the meta-analyses that show that swapping out saturated fat, replacing saturated fat with like vegetable oils actually increases mortality. They're allowed to like just selectively not even look at that and just say, oh, nope, we're still going to say saturated fat is bad. If I could have one thing happen, it would be to dissolve that type of closed door policy and allow more open door talk and be way more evidence based when it comes to our nutritional recommendations. I think if we don't fix that, we're never going to fix population nutritional advice.
And so one like core way to do that would be removing industry influence and research. Would that be one element?
Yeah, 100%. So it's kind of the bad nutritional advice feeds pharma, right? Because if it makes you sick, then you can take 5 pills because you have all these disease states. And it's just how right now nutrition policy is in the United States. It is that vicious cycle of feeding one industry, the sickness and the illness. It's really, we're not healthcare, right? We're sick care, and it's a big issue.
Yeah. So as a basic scientist and researcher yourself, were you kind of concerned to launch like a book like this? It's a little going away because it's the DASH diet and low sodium and all that sort of stuff. Are you kind of putting yourself out there and maybe taking the chin a little bit when it comes to like publishing in high-end journals, like you mentioned, BMJ and so forth?
Sure, yeah. There's always going to be, nutrition has almost become more politics than science, right? So, definitely there are a little bit of bullying going around if you go against what some of the guidelines are saying. And so, yeah, that definitely can happen. But I honestly feel that I have so much research poured into this book and make such a compelling case. I stand by everything that is in the book, and I honestly have no reservations about it because there's just so much information and references in there.
Yeah, so if people overlook the title and actually dive into it, there's not much they can really actually say.
Yeah, exactly.
To kind of, brilliant. James, I really appreciate you coming on the show. We learned a ton from you. You're very active on Twitter, like you mentioned. So if there's one resource online where people, if they want to connect and follow you and see what you're up to in the future, where would that be?
Yeah, that would definitely be Twitter at Dr. James Dinic. I'm pretty good at, if someone has a question, kind of giving them some good general information to set them on the path to a healthier life.
Brilliant. Appreciate you coming on the show,
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it, man.
A lot of good times.
Awesome.